When the term Mesozoic era is mentioned, your mind likely immediately pivots to one specific image: dinosaurs. You probably envision colossal T-Rexes, heavily armored Triceratops, and gargantuan beasts dominating a prehistoric wonderland. However, that portrayal is a complete fabrication, at least regarding the initial 50 million years before dinosaurs ever ascended to the throne. Our world was a far more surreal landscape. Welcome to the Triassic. Following the single most catastrophic extinction event in planetary history, in which 90% of all life was obliterated, Earth was left in ruins. What emerged from those desolate ashes wasn't a structured kingdom. It was an evolutionary Wild West, because the planet's canvas had been wiped essentially clean. Nature discarded the rulebook entirely. The byproduct? A 50-million-year epic defined by some of the most grotesque, anatomically bewildering freaks to ever traverse the land, navigate the seas, or engage in savage combat. Forget the dinosaurs. The dawn of the Mesozoic was governed by an entirely different set of monsters. Here are the 5 most eccentric creatures of the Triassic. Before we encounter these organisms, we must rewind 252 million years. The madness of the Triassic is incomprehensible without first acknowledging the disaster that paved its way, the Permian-Triassic mass extinction, known ominously as the Great Dying. Do you believe the asteroid that ended the age of dinosaurs was devastating? By comparison, that event was merely a scratch. No meteor was responsible here. Rather, Earth itself mobilized to eradicate its own inhabitants. In what we now identify as Siberia, the crust was violently ruptured over tens of thousands of years. Lava inundated millions of square miles. A massive influx of greenhouse gases was pumped into the atmosphere, causing global temperatures to soar. As the oceans heated, they were stripped of oxygen and transformed into vast, acidic basins. Consequently, over 95% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates were snuffed out. Earth was essentially converted into a quiet, burning sepulcher. As the sparse remnants of life struggled to rebound and step into the Triassic, they encountered a drastically altered landscape. The 7 modern continents were nowhere to be found. Instead, all terrestrial land had collided and merged into a singular supercontinent extending from pole to pole Pangaea. Enveloping this massive landmass was a global sea dubbed Panthalassa. Picture Pangaea as a generator for extreme weather. Its coastlines were routinely lashed by monsoon systems that paleoclimatologists speculate carried a destructive intensity far exceeding any modern superstorm. Simultaneously, the continent's interior was entirely cut off from oceanic moisture, resulting in an expansive, arid desert characterized by extreme diurnal temperature shifts. Without polar ice caps, the heat was unrelenting and absolute. Yet, this profound desolation acted as the ultimate catalyst for evolution, because most life had been eradicated. Ecological niches, the specialized functions within a food web, remained vacant. No apex predators existed to curtail growth, nor were there massive herds to monopolize nutritional resources. Surviving organisms discovered that the brutal laws of competition had temporarily been suspended. That was when nature truly began to gamble, operating within an environment devoid of constraints. Evolution descended into chaos. It entered a phase of frenzied experimentation, spontaneously generating bizarre biological prototypes to identify the most viable survival forms. Some species opted for heavy, thorny plating. Others stretched their anatomy to levels that defied the laws of physics. Some even manifested as hybrid machines never before witnessed. Now that you understand the severity of the Pangaean stage, it is time for the curtain to rise on the most successful and peculiar specimens of this evolutionary laboratory. At number 5, we find a beast that resembles a hybrid between a gargantuan lizard, a feral boar, and a potato. Meet the Hyperodapedon. This animal, a member of an ancient reptilian lineage known as Brachiosaurus, averaged between 15 and 2 meters in length and possessed a stocky, muscular frame with a center of gravity kept quite low to the ground. At first glance, it hardly appears to be a masterpiece of natural engineering. It was ungainly, somewhat lethargic, lacked thick defensive armor, and was devoid of lethal claws. Yet, do not be deceived by its stout appearance. The true marvel of Hyperodapedon isn't found in its limbs or skin, but in its cranium, a biological pulverizing machine designed with terrifying precision. At the tip of its snout, the creature sported a downward curving, sharp, bony structure akin to the beak of a massive raptor. Mechanically speaking, however, this component functioned precisely like a heavy-duty bone bolt cutter. Based on the erosion patterns observed on the snout, paleontologists have concluded that this robust beak was employed like a pickaxe, enabling the animal to hack into the parched, cracked earth of the Pangean supercontinent to unearth roots. In many respects, it functioned much like a miniature, prehistoric excavation machine, however. The most eccentric and intricate component was located deep within its oral cavity. Unlike the herbivores you might be familiar with, the Hyperodapedon lacked a conventional grinding jaw. Instead, a deep longitudinal groove was formed in the center of its upper palate by 2 parallel rows of teeth. Conversely, the lower mandible contained only a single line of high, razor-sharp teeth. Perfect precision was achieved when the animal snapped its mouth shut. As the lower teeth seated themselves flawlessly into the upper groove, functionally, this mechanism operated much like the way a pocketknife blade retracts into its casing, or perhaps the operation of an industrial metal milling tool. Rather than laboriously grinding surfaces away, it sliced through forage vertically. Why would Mother Nature design such an elaborate shearing apparatus? The answer is found in the extreme hostility of Triassic flora. At that time, vegetation, primarily seed ferns like dicrodium, was neither succulent nor soft. To endure the scorching desert climate, these plants had evolved to be exceptionally fibrous, possessing the toughness of steel cables and being embedded with silica sand crystals. Had these animals relied on typical herbivorous dentition, their teeth would have been worn down to the gums in short order, leading to starvation. Fortunately, thanks to this unique pocketknife configuration, the Hyperodapedon could effortlessly shear through and ingest that reinforced vegetation. This bizarre adaptation served as an ultimate survival strategy. Despite appearing somewhat ridiculous and haphazardly assembled, the biomechanical design of the Hyperodapedon proved so effective that they multiplied in staggering numbers. Their remains have been unearthed globally, from the United Kingdom to India, Africa, and South America. They reigned supreme as the planet's premier biological lawnmowers, completely dominating the low-level Triassic landscape. Evolution had effectively engineered a perfect machine for keeping its nose to the grindstone. Yet, while the Hyperodapedon was occupied with tilling the mud, a separate evolutionary branch was clumsily attempting to reach for the heavens. In fourth place, we observe an ambitious yet awkward endeavor by nature the early sauropodomorphs, the precursors to the long-necked dinosaurs. When you think of herbivorous dinosaurs, you likely immediately visualize the massive, 4-story tall biological machines of the Jurassic Period, such as Brachiosaurus or Diplodocus. However, during the Triassic, such perfected giants were non-existent. Instead, we see a prototypical version riddled with awkward compromises, most famously represented by the Plateosaurus, spanning between 6 and 10 meters. The body of the Brachiosaurus represented a tug-of-war between 2 competing evolutionary strategies. Though it was a herbivore, it remained trapped within the anatomical constraints of a bipedal creature. Imagine a mechanical system suffering from severe instability to process the rugged Triassic vegetation. The Brachiosaurus required an expansive gut an intestinal tract that functioned like an industrial fermentation vat. Consequently, it was burdened with a broad, heavy abdomen, yet, ironically, its pelvis and hind limbs were engineered for vertical movement. This misalignment of its center of gravity rendered it a wobbling titan for decades. Scholars debated whether they traversed the land on all fours, however. The mystery has been settled by modern biomechanical computer simulations. The structural arrangement of the Brachiosaurus's forearm bones precluded them from rotating their palms toward the ground. Had they attempted quadrupedal locomotion, their bones would have crossed and shattered like a gorilla. They would have been forced to knuckle walk. Therefore, they were obligated to move on their two rear legs, utilizing a thick, muscular tail as a counterbalance, a necessity that resulted in a somewhat ungainly and heavy gait. Furthermore, the patchwork anatomy did not end there. Its two forelimbs hung suspended in the air, equipped with grasping digits and a massive thumb claw as lethal as that of a bear. This was clearly a vestige inherited from its carnivorous ancestors. It is now hypothesized by scientists that this claw arrangement was repurposed to serve as anchors, enabling them to grasp and tug at towering conifer and fern branches. By extending their necks like rudimentary cranes, they managed to monopolize canopy-based food sources, far outpacing ground dwellers like the Hyperodapedon. Furthermore, that singular claw functioned as their only means of defense. These long-necked precursors to dinosaurs perfectly exemplify nature's trial and error phase. Despite being burdened with a biological blueprint riddled with physical irrationalities, they were remarkably successful and thrived long enough to pave the way for their illustrious descendants. However, massive proportions did not equate to absolute dominance during the Triassic. These clumsy herbivorous machines remained mere prey, constantly forced to shiver in vigilance, as the apex of the food chain was not occupied by dinosaurs, but by brutal, armored tanks lurking in the gloom. In our third spot, a major misconception regarding planetary history must be addressed. Many people mistakenly assume that dinosaurs immediately ascended to the apex of the food chain upon the dawn of the Triassic. But this is entirely fallacious. In reality, dinosaurs were merely the underdogs operating in the background for those 50 million years. The true throne, the authority that governed the land, belonged to a group of super reptiles, collectively known as archosaurs, or ruling lizards. Specifically, these animals occupied the ancestral branch of modern crocodiles. Yet they were far from lazy sunbathers. They were genuine terrestrial titans, participating in one of the most savage biological arms races in history. In this competition, defensive capabilities were pushed to the absolute limit by nature to produce living fortresses. The Desmatocytus stands as the quintessential representative of this class, reaching lengths of up to 5 meters and weighing approximately 1 ton. It resembled a mutant, herbivorous crocodile. Its most bewildering feature, however, was not its bulk, but its monolithic system of armor, dragon-like. Interlocking osteoderms shielded the animal's entire back, belly, and tail. The design didn't stop there, though. 2 massive, curved, bony spikes as keen as buffalo horns protruded from its shoulders. Because of this heavy defensive array, it was rendered exceptionally sluggish. But speed was unnecessary. As a mobile bunker, any predator foolish enough to strike would be met with a shattered jaw or be impaled upon those shoulder spears. This is a clear testament to nature's prioritization of absolute survival in the face of heavy-duty threats. Nevertheless, in an environment where prey evolves into armored vehicles, predators must likewise adapt into ultimate machines of destruction. The true harbinger of terror, the tyrant of the Triassic, was not the T-Rex, but the Pastosuchus, as the era's largest terrestrial carnivore. It could reach lengths of 8 to 10 meters, unlike modern crocodiles, which are forced to sprawl with limbs splayed outward. The Physalasachus, an apex relative, utilized legs positioned vertically beneath its frame, much like contemporary mammals. This superior mechanical configuration transformed it into a high-speed pursuit specialist. Its primary weapon was a colossal skull outfitted with razor-sharp, backward-curving serrated teeth. Its bite was designed not merely to crush, but to shear deep into flesh and excise massive chunks. The sheer power of this tyrant's bite was sufficient to penetrate any armor. The existence of such a creature serves as a firm affirmation that in the Triassic, carnivorous dinosaurs were merely shadows cowering beneath the heels of the ruling lizards, while the Archosaurian arms race produced perfect biological weaponry. Nature also functions as a mad scientist, occasionally producing hybrids that defy every convention. What occurs when evolution decides to stitch together the disparate parts of an anteater, a bird, and a lizard into one organism? We will temporarily vacate the fiery battlefield of armored giants in our second spot to enter the dense primeval forests. Dangling from the canopy is a creature that defies all anatomical logic, the Drepanosaurus. If any evidence exists that nature once played the role of a delirious doctor, Frankenstein scavenging random components and sewing them into one entity, this animal is it. When paleontologists initially unearthed Drepanosaurus fossils in northern Italy, they were profoundly confounded. Its skeleton appeared so grotesque that for a significant duration, researchers suspected that these were merely the remains of multiple different species that had been buried together in a jumbled heap. However, the discovery was verified as a single individual. Picture an animal the size of a large house cat, featuring a tiny head and a sharp, avian-like beak, yet that head served only as the prologue to a symphony of oddities. Just observe its forelimbs. The osteological architecture of the Drepanosaurus's limbs and hands bears no resemblance to any reptile ever documented. Rather than possessing digits splayed for gripping tree trunks or cliff faces, its second finger underwent an extreme transformation, culminating in a colossal, sickle-shaped talon. It bore a striking resemblance to the claws found on contemporary anteaters. To power this oversized appendage, a massive muscular bulk was required in the shoulder region, resulting in a pronounced hump that crested high above its back. According to biomechanical theory, scientists have formulated a robust hypothesis that this was never intended as a weapon for combat. Instead, it served as a natural crowbar. This talon was utilized as a leverage device, enabling the creature to rip through stubborn bark and fissure open decaying logs to harvest the fatty larvae and insects dwelling within. Furthermore, the anatomical eccentricity of Drepanosaurus extended to the very end of its frame. While numerous species such as chameleons or various South American monkeys utilize their tails as a fifth limb for grasping branches, Drepanosaurus pushed this adaptation beyond conventional physical boundaries. Capping its tail was not a tapering point of soft flesh, but a remarkably sturdy, hooked osseous structure. Indeed, a sharp, bony claw sprouted directly from the terminal end of its tail. While first-hand observations of their behavior are impossible, researchers utilizing computer simulations contend that when the animal suspended itself by its hind limbs to strip bark with its hands, this caudal claw would lock into the wood like an anchor by providing critical support. This mechanism allowed the creature to stabilize its body mid-air, effectively resisting the recoil force generated whenever it attempted to tear the timber apart. The existence of Drepanosaurus is far from a mere biological prank. Rather, it offers a fascinating study in the concept of convergent evolution. This phenomenon describes how nature, when confronted with analogous survival challenges across disparate eras, autonomously settles upon identical mechanical designs in unrelated organisms. Hundreds of millions of years prior to the emergence of modern mammals like sloths or silky anteaters, nature had already perfected an identical engineering blueprint. Having surveyed the ecological niches within the canopy, evolution determined that a specialized bark-peeling machine was required, and it utilized the skeletal framework of a Triassic reptile to construct it. Drepanosaurus functioned as an incredibly efficient hybrid. Regardless of its bizarre appearance, every component served a distinct and logical mechanical function. However, nature occasionally refuses to settle for simple, purposeful patchwork. At times, the laboratory of evolution unveils profoundly flawed creations, biological designs that flagrantly defy all laws regarding balance and gravity. Miraculously, some of these entities persisted and thrived. Which brings us to the number one spot, the Mesozoic beast, with the most absurd anatomical configuration of them all. At the summit of our list, we arrive at the pinnacle of Triassic insanity. If the four previous creatures represented deliberate, survival-oriented designs, this animal appears to be a severe technical malfunction of nature. Its configuration blatantly violates every principle of structural integrity. Gravity and equilibrium. Meet Tanystropheus, the most peculiar living crane to ever inhabit the prehistoric world. Upon viewing the reconstructed skeleton of Tanystropheus, your instincts will immediately signal that something is fundamentally amiss. Though the animal averaged roughly 6 meters in length, its neck alone comprised over 3 meters of that span. Consider the absurdity. Its neck was longer than its tail and torso combined. You could formulate a basic mental image of Tanystropheus by imagining a gargantuan python grafted onto the body of a mid-sized lizard. Yet, what truly astounded the scientific community was not its sheer length, but the contradictory mechanics housed within that neck. To achieve both length and flexibility, nature usually increases the number of vertebrae, as seen in modern swans or colossal herbivorous dinosaurs. In this primitive reptile, however, evolution took a vastly different gamble. Tanystropheus possessed a mere 13 cervical vertebrae, a count only slightly higher than that of a human, and identical to the neck vertebrae found in a giraffe. To reach such a terrifying length, each individual vertebra was stretched to an extreme degree, appearing precisely like segments of bony PVC piping linked together. This gangly configuration immediately introduced a severe physics dilemma. How did this neck avoid snapping under its own mass? The secret resided in its internal reinforcement system. Running lengthwise across these elongated vertebrae were bundles of cervical ribs, tightly interwoven and crisscrossed, much like the load-bearing steel cables of a bridge. Consequently, contrary to its seemingly pliable appearance, the neck of Tanystropheus was remarkably rigid. It could neither undulate like a serpent nor reach vertically into the clouds. Instead, the neck functioned primarily as a giant horizontal lever, placing immense strain upon the animal's shoulders and delicate forelimbs. This mechanical puzzle sparked a heated, decades-long debate among paleontologists. How could a creature hampered by such an imbalanced center of gravity and a waddling gait effectively hunt? Today, through the application of 3D skull scans and hydrodynamic modeling, experts have identified the most plausible and chilling scenario. Tanystropheus was certainly not a terrestrial predator. It was a specialized ambush machine lurking in the shallow, coastal waters of the Panthalassa Ocean. Imagine the scene. Tanystropheus would submerge its body, utilizing the sheer mass of its lower torso as a fixed anchor. Its 3-meter-long rigid neck would then extend far from its body, suspended in the water column, keeping its tiny head outfitted with fangs that interlocked like a fish trap in a state of absolute, motionless perfection. Unsuspecting fish and squid drifting through the vicinity saw only a minuscule head bobbing in the murky depths, completely oblivious to the fact that a gargantuan predator was anchored 3 meters away. Once a target entered its range, the Tanystropheus would trigger a rapid muscular contraction at the base of its neck, launching its entire head and foreneck forward like a spear. The prey was pinned before it could even formulate a reaction. While this served as a highly efficient mechanical hunting tactic, it came with a perilous life or death trade-off, because the neck was both cumbersome and lacking in flexibility. The Tanystropheus was frequently transformed into a sitting duck for larger-scale predators. Any wandering marine giant could easily sever that awkward appendage. This is not mere conjecture. Paleontologists have recovered Tanystropheus skulls still attached to several cervical vertebrae, with deep, jagged tooth marks etched into the bone. This serves as the ultimate testament to the bloody, tragic conclusions that await any creature possessing such an extreme and precarious physical design. Despite sporting an anatomy that defied every rule of practicality, the Tanystropheus cannot be considered a failure. On the contrary, these creatures persisted and flourished for tens of millions of years. Their success as an anomalous species serves as the most potent affirmation of the unfettered chaos and extreme liberation that defined the Triassic epoch. After examining these 5 bizarre monsters, you are likely wrestling with a fundamental question. Why? What conditions within the Earth's environment forced the biological system to generate such grotesque morphologies? The answer is found in the most brutal climatic phenomena this planet has ever endured. We have surveyed the patchwork biomechanical machines, the thorny, tank-like behemoths, and even the configurations that violated every principle of engineering. But what, exactly, provided the Triassic with the tolerance for such eccentric forms? To comprehend this bedlam, we must delve into the inner mechanics of the evolutionary engine. The primary catalyst, the core cause, is the prevalence of vacant ecological niches. Let your mind drift back to the great dying mentioned earlier. That catastrophic annihilation provided what evolutionary biologists describe as a blank canvas. In a balanced, stable ecosystem, every role, every niche is already occupied by specialists. From the apex predators to the scavengers and herbivorous machines, typically in a crowded ecosystem, any bizarre mutation or physical deviation is met with rapid extinction because the pressure of competition is simply too fierce. However, at the dawn of the Triassic, those rigid laws were momentarily suspended. There were no apex killers lying in wait, nor were there massive herds monopolizing every patch of greenery. Because fierce competitive pressure had vanished, organisms were granted the freedom to develop in almost unimaginable directions. When the fight for resources is non-existent, a hybrid entity like the Brachiosaurus, sporting an anteater's claws and an avian beak, could exist without consequence. Evolution was no longer enslaved by the pursuit of perfection. The only requirement for survival was being good enough to persist. This triggered an explosion of adaptive radiation, where nature began to cast the dice, experimenting with every possible biological blueprint. A second factor accelerating this strangeness was the unforgiving habitat of the Permian supercontinent. If the absence of predators provided the opportunity, it was the extreme climate that acted as the sledgehammer, forging these jagged, unconventional forms. As all tectonic plates fused into one singular landmass, the entire atmospheric circulation system was fundamentally overhauled. Deep within the heart of Pangaea, thousands of miles from the coastline, the moisture provided by the Panthalassa Ocean was completely blocked from reaching the interior. Vast, scorching superdeserts expanded across the interior, arid and punishing. Concurrently, the coastlines were plagued by the mega-monsoon phenomenon, a byproduct of extreme temperature differentials. Paleoclimatologists speculate that these meteorological engines unleashed winds of destructive velocity and rainfall of unprecedented intensity. Mild seasons were non-existent in the Triassic. Instead, the world was trapped in a cycle, alternating between cataclysmic flooding and prolonged, bone-dry droughts. Animals were compelled to undergo mechanical transformations to endure this climate. because plants had evolved to be as fibrous as steel cables to preserve moisture. Creatures like the Hyperodapedon were forced to develop sophisticated shearing mandibles. Furthermore, thick, bony plating was grown by reptile species to curtail water evaporation under the relentless, blistering heat. These eccentricities were not some frivolous creative jest. They were the most robust biomechanical solutions available for withstanding a planet that daily attempted to eradicate its inhabitants. Thirdly, the entirety of the Triassic was overshadowed by a phase of evolutionary experimentation, what might be termed the beta testing period of the Mesozoic. If you examine the later Jurassic or Cretaceous, you will find perfection by then. Dinosaurs had evolved into optimized biological machines, with every muscle bundle refined for size and speed. Conversely, during the Triassic, evolution functioned like an engineer stumbling through a laboratory. Control over the game was held by no single entity. A chaotic biological battlefield raged between three primary factions: the synapsids, the ancestors of mammals, the heavily armored archosaurs, and the early, timid dinosaurs sprinting on two legs. Uncontrollable anatomical diversity was birthed from the rivalry between these lineages. Patchwork prototypes were churned out by nature. Gangly necks were attached to waddling torsos. Avian beaks were fitted onto reptilian skulls, and hands were morphed into iron hooks. Ultimately, most of these clunky configurations would be revealed as evolutionary dead ends. Yet, throughout the 50-million-year span of the Triassic, while ecological regulations remained lax, those flawed designs functioned efficiently enough to achieve dominance. The Triassic was transformed into a festival of the bizarre by the combination of a lawless arms race, an unforgiving climate, and an empty playground. However, all experiments must eventually reach their conclusion, for Mother Nature is a merciless judge. As the Triassic drew to a close, she elected to trigger the reset button once more. No endeavor, regardless of how brilliant or insane, is immune to an eventual end. The dominance of these grotesque creatures was not terminated by a plummeting space rock, but rather by forces rising once again from the planet's mantle. This was the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event. Approximately 201 million years ago, the supercontinent Pangaea began to rift asunder. So violent was this tectonic fragmentation that the Earth's crust was ripped open, forming a massive tear that would, tens of millions of years later, mature into the Atlantic Ocean. One of the largest volcanic cataclysms in geological history, known as the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, CAMP, was triggered as massive volumes of magma surged from this fault zone. Millions of cubic miles of lava were disgorged, accompanied by an influx of greenhouse gases, principally sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide, which were vented directly into the atmosphere. The result was a global climate disaster that unfolded with terrifying swiftness. Temperatures skyrocketed across the planet, superdeserts were rendered even more arid, and the oceans suffered rapid acidification. The collapse of the food web was an inevitability. It was at this juncture that the most ruthless law of evolution was exposed. Overspecialization is a death sentence. Let us reflect upon the biological contraptions we have examined. Desmatosaceous, weighed down by massive, osseous plates, functioned as a stationary bastion. The Hyperodapedon, meanwhile, possessed scissor-like mandibles suited for only a singular variety of flora. Then there was tawny Strophius, hampered by an unwieldy neck that operated effectively only within calm. Literal zones in each instance. Their fates were sealed by an over-reliance on excessively specialized mechanical configurations. Consequently, when the environment shifted drastically and food webs disintegrated, these bulky mechanisms lacked the capacity for timely adaptation, leading to their total erasure from the planet. Even the mighty archosaurs, the ruling lizards that once stood atop the food chain, were toppled as the Earth was rendered lethal once again. Who, then, managed to endure? The victors were those organisms that had previously been relegated to the periphery. Early dinosaurs wielded an absolute biological edge flexibility. Agile movement was permitted by their bipedal skeletons, which also minimized energy expenditure. More importantly, their anatomical structures served as versatile blueprints. They were generalists. They were never shackled to a solitary niche or a rigid method of predation. Thanks to this supreme adaptability, as the armored titans collapsed, dinosaurs successfully navigated the narrow straits of extinction, thereby inheriting the globe and inaugurating the illustrious Jurassic era we so often venerate. Nevertheless, characterizing creatures like Phaseolus or Dinosaurs as evolutionary failures would be a grave injustice and a scientific blunder. One must remember that they governed this world for 50 million years. To put that in perspective, the entire span of human evolutionary history, stretching from primate ancestors to modern day, covers only roughly 6 to 7 million years. These Triassic organisms were far from mere comic relief. They were magnificent pioneers. They stand as the most vibrant evidence of nature's unmatched capability to reconstruct life from ruin, yielding the wildest, freest, and most mechanically daring epoch our planet has ever experienced. Thus concludes our exploration of the top 5 most eccentric beasts of the Triassic, alongside the evolutionary riddles that dictated their rise and decline. Which of these biological machines left the deepest impression on you? Was it the physics-defying reach of the Tanystropheus, or perhaps the hybrid talons of the Drepanosaurus? We invite you to share your insights in the comments section below. If you found this excursion into the distant past rewarding, ensure you hit the like button, subscribe, and enable notifications so you stay informed about our future content regarding Earth's primal history. Farewell, and we look forward to seeing you again.